Welcome to Lead and Thrive. This is Daniel Torres, your host. One of the main challenges in the corporate world is connecting the top levels with the nitty-gritty day-to-day operations and details, which ultimately can make the business win. Today, I have the pleasure to have John Bauer on the show. He's led big teams at the highest levels of organizations like Target, Starbucks, and TJX. In this discussion, I hope to understand how a supply chain C-level leader can get involved in business execution, for example, by leveraging technology. Hi, John. How are you? Thanks for joining us today.
I'm doing really well. Hello, how are you?
Very good. Actually, a very rainy Barcelona today, believe it or not. So, yeah.
Well, I'm sitting in Minnesota in the U.S. and it is very cold. So tomorrow is Thanksgiving and we're expecting a high of 20 Fahrenheit. So it's going to be quite cold.
How much would that be in Celsius?
-2, 3.
Wow, goodness gracious. It never gets as cold as that here, or maybe one time a year or something like that maximum, imagine.
Yeah. In Minnesota, quite often that's the high. So I'm not sure why we live here, but we sure make the best of it.
Well, a lot of people like Minnesota. I've tried to headhunt people from Minnesota outside to move somewhere else. And I can tell you, it's not easy. So there must be something to it.
Yes, very much a really good quality of life, relatively friendly people, and again, take advantage of the outdoors, both in the summer and, believe it or not, in the winter.
I never asked you that actually, John. Are you a local or?
Yeah, I'm originally, although I've lived all over the world and worked for different companies, I was born in a small town in southern Minnesota in the U.S., and I grew up on a farm, and we raised animals and farmed crops. So grew up as a farm boy who kind of turned into a city mouse then.
Well, and now you live in the Minneapolis area, I assume.
Correct. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and we live in St. Paul in the city, to be more specific.
Okay. So in the lesser known Twin City, then.
Lesser known, but the better known or the better city. So we definitely like St. Paul. It's a little smaller cousin to Minneapolis, but it's really what we call punches above its weight. So we've got sports teams, we've got the opera, we have museums, parks. So quality of life quite good here.
As it's come to think about it, I mean, in the Twin Cities area, there are a lot of multinationals that are headquartered there. I think that the whole area probably punches above its weight to a certain extent, no?
Yeah, good point.
So maybe for the audience to get a bit acquainted to you, John, and of course they can have a look at your LinkedIn, but maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself and how you got to where you got.
I've been working in the supply chain and logistics business for 20, 25 years. I really started my career a little bit later in life when I first started at Target stores, the big $100 billion U.S. retailer, and started on second shift in a distribution department. And I managed the warehouse there, and I sort of worked my way up over 7-8 years. And then from there, I moved around the world a little bit, and I spent some time at Kohl's department stores. Again, there, I did international logistics. From there, I moved to Starbucks in Seattle, and so I kind of went from Minneapolis, St. Paul to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Seattle, Washington, managed logistics. And then my last role there, I lived and worked in China. And I was the head of Starbucks Shanghai supply chain company, essentially all supply chain functions for kind of the growth period of Starbucks in China. So that was really a great experience. After that, I moved to Boston, Massachusetts. So I'm sort of almost covered the whole globe now.
Yeah.
And there I was the chief logistics officer for TJX companies. And the audience sometimes maybe doesn't always know what TJX is, but TJX is the parent company for retailers TK Maxx in Europe, HomeSense in Europe, Winners in Canada, TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Home Goods in the US, and TK Maxx in Australia.
And it's a fashion retailer that's actually done very well in the last years. I mean, I think they suffered a bit during the pandemic, obviously, because they're very like physical brick and mortar retail focused. But until then, and I think that now they're probably back to where they were in 2019, they were doing very, very well.
Yeah, very well, expanding, really great experience. I had multiple functions there as chief logistics officer for the supply chain. I had, of course, transportation, logistics, global trade compliance. I also had environmental sustainability, which really sort of helped me throughout my career, distribution engineering, site selection. So really a broad vendor operations and vendor management to really a broad spectrum.
Yeah, yeah.
And then finally, my wife and I and my young son, we decided that we would try to move back a little bit closer to home after we've sort of moved all over the country and the world. And I came back to Target in Minneapolis for about a year and a half. And there I managed all of inventory management and transportation and logistics. And then decided a little bit less than 2 years ago to sort of not, I wouldn't say retire, but pause and take a little bit of time off. I'd been working and traveling nonstop for 20 years. And believe it or not, then COVID hit and I decided to do some consulting and advising. And candidly, I've been busier than almost that I ever have been. With the slight caveat is that maybe managing a little bit more on my own terms. So now I'm doing some deep retained consulting with a couple different clients. I do a lot of advisory work with the major consulting companies where I come in as an expert advisor. I'm on 2 different boards of directors. I'm on the board of Centerpoint Properties, which is about a $10 billion, primarily US-based industrial real estate company focusing on warehousing in and around ports, railroads, and last mile logistics. And then I'm also on the board of directors of a company called Standard Holding Company, which is the holding company for a couple different smaller companies, but also a third-party logistics company.
Yeah. So, I mean, with the enumeration that you've done, obviously quite a lot on your plate right now. And when you think back of when you started at Target back in the day, I mean, how have you seen, if you think of supply chain now and then, especially in retail, which is the industry that you know best, but now actually, since you're doing more consulting work, you've probably seen other industries, how they work as well. I mean, how has it changed over the years between then and now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I've been had over the last, I think especially during COVID, it's really given not just me, but I think our profession a chance to reflect on that. And over those years, I would say some aspects of supply chain have changed considerably. So things like moving to much more global sourcing and moving sourcing of goods and not just retail, but also manufacturing components and that type of thing, much more global, much more what I'd say looking at labor cost as initial sourcing locations and then eventually getting to some other aspects of those decision makings. So I think that's changed over the years. Technology has changed, but what I think the big change in technology has been it's made things like sourcing, supply chain, and logistics more flexible. And, we sort of moved from a mainframe. Most of your audience probably doesn't remember what mainframe computing is. I barely do. To sort of ERP centric, to software, to cloud, and now to sort of API application based. So I think what that has created is a much more nimbler supply chain networks, or nimbler and flexible. So that's sort of some of the good evolution. I would also say that much about supply chain is the same or hasn't progressed, especially in some areas like logistics and transportation, where things are done very similar or the same. And even in some cases, there's been some regression. And what I would tell you is a lot of the gridlock and things that are happening right now is kind of over time, because aspects of the supply chain were so inefficient, a lot of it has been intermediated, especially in transportation and logistics. And a lot of it has been arbitraged. So you see a lot of insertion of financial companies controlling aspects or links in the supply chain, but no one controlling end-to-end supply chain. And I'm talking a little bit more about both operations, but also technology. And so to me, that's sort of maybe a weak link, as all these very flexible systems came into place. But I think leaders have had a difficult time as pulling it all together. And so that's kind of the great irony of things that have happened over my career. And then just lastly, because so many things, what I call COVID, so from a supply chain perspective, COVID has impacted every supply chain and has impacted the globally. But the reality of it is, it really hasn't done anything in supply chain. And what I mean by that is what I call COVID was the great, I call it AAM, the accelerator, the great amplifier, and then the great magnifier. So most of the things that are happening in supply chains right now, COVID didn't cause any of it. It was all leading up to this. It just accelerated it now, almost a 2-year part of time. So.
When you're talking about like all the things that have happened, what things have happened?
Over time or during COVID?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that something has happened in the due to that COVID has accelerated some aspects of supply chain that have happened in the last couple of years. Which ones are the most relevant ones?
Yeah, I think this whole idea of all these intermediaries and over time companies chasing lowest cost and just in time. So if I go through that end-to-end supply chain and I think about, I do a lot of advisory work in this area, is in international logistics, as an example. And if you think about a container, and we all hear about containers in ports, but if you think about how let's just call it an item or a widget starts at some manufacturing point in Asia, and how it moves through the supply chain, even after it's manufactured, all the way to the end consumer, you're literally hitting hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of data points. And those data points, although that is more technology, are reflective of all the different operations that item or that carton goes through. So for instance, you have origin trucking, and sometimes origin trucking is controlled by the shipper, sometimes it's controlled by the consignee, sometimes it's controlled by a third party, all these different aspects. So that's just one small aspect. And then you hit the port, and then you hit the ship if you actually get space. And oh, by the way, the container itself may or may not be owned by the steamship line. So then it gets to a US port where it waits. It's on a steamship line that enters a terminal that is not owned by the steamship line primarily, but also has been intermediated. And then once again, that process keeps going and going. It may have different rules for different terminals. It may be using union labor. It may not be using union labor. It's then loaded onto a chassis at a port. Is that chassis owned by anyone that has actually a stake in the cargo? Probably not. It's probably been intermediated by a finance company. So once again, I can go all the way down the line.
Yeah.
That transaction itself, think about that both from a technology standpoint, but actually an operations standpoint, the difficulty it is to manage that.
Yeah. And what's the consequence of that?
Lack of visibility, incredible, what I'll call complexity in that visibility, and in the ability to be transparent. It isn't, a desired state to be not transparent, but I think there's so many complexities in all of those transactions. What happens then is that those links in supply chain are solved because, supply chain leaders are smart, bright people that are going to always be able to manage, but they're solved in increments and components. And because people don't have the time, resources, and at times expertise to solve them all. So I think the result of that is a very, very fragmented, but moreover, a super inefficient global logistics network.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that the logic would say that probably technology could be a solution for this complexity that's causing these issues, or well, obvious issues, and I guess certain frictions in the global trade right now. Is that the solution, or in other words, how can technology help in the next few years with supply chain, or how can it shape it to be more efficient?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that Nate, and you see that with a lot of startup companies now, and lots of different attempts at managing this complexity. The watch out, the concern with the technology, and I've been guilty about this in my career, quite candidly, is that much of the technology that's being created, the good part is it's there to solve specific problems. So let's say maybe it's a technology that solves for drayage trucking in and around ports. I'll just make that up as an example. But the danger is so that may help part of the problem. The danger is how is that technology solution integrated into the other links? And I think what you're seeing in this global gridlock is what it is that the solutions are at times compounding the problems. So steamship lines bringing new ships on is not going to really help this problem at all. In fact, could exacerbate it. Retailers chartering vessels, as another example, really doesn't help the problem at all. It only exacerbates it. So what we've come down to is because our solutions are so microcentric, it's actually exacerbating the rest of the supply chain gridlock.
Got it. So the solutions are actually very short-term focused and are not really, doesn't look like they're aimed to solve a more structural issue, no?
Correct.
Yeah. So what's the solution then? What are you advising the companies that you're consulting with in general? Is there like a general vision that we have to go towards to?
I think in a lot of the work that I'm doing it's much more fundamental than, so it's not going to be super sexy on this podcast here. It's really around understanding and mapping process and ensuring the right processes in place for shippers and for my customers and my clients and the companies I'm working for. So that part is fairly, I'm going to say simplistic. It's not a simple process given what I've already explained. And really good process will lead its way into better adaption in technology. And generally that it hasn't worked in my career. It hasn't really worked like that. So often supply chain leaders are chasing technologies in order to help the process. And if you start with fundamental process, you'll be able to apply some technologies to that. The other part that I think is probably the number one opportunity in supply chains now, and I think lots of folks are going to say, yeah, we know this, but is around inventory management and visibility into how and where you manage your inventory, I think, is by far much more important than some of these other fragmented solutions I'm talking about. Inventory placement, and then furthermore, what I'm going to call something like inventory segmentation. And the global supply chain, because it was built for cost and efficiency, isn't always really good at segmenting the inventory that is important to the consumer, let's just say. But it can be for the manufacturing plant to the next link in the supply chain. Again, easier said than done. And again, but if you think about it, COVID, and folks might be saying, well, yeah, but COVID came and then we stayed at home and our demand for different consumer goods was greater. Other goods were less so. But the fundamental problem to solve all along, it wasn't really about consumer demand. That would be data that would help overlay its inventory management. Is how did we manage inventory even before COVID? And I think what COVID exposed was some of the stockouts. Everybody talks about toilet paper, which was only now a year and a half ago. That's a perfect example of that. That I think these supply chains were so inflexible and rigid, and there was a lack of ability on managing inventory, be it a component part in the process or finished goods, that you saw these stockouts.
Okay. And if you look back, by the way, like you mentioned that there's well, I think that you didn't mention it explicitly, but reading between the lines, I can tell that you think that sometimes technology is just overused as like a solution for a part of the process. What technologies do you think have failed in supply chain or been overused in the past?
Yeah, because I've done a lot of work in the fulfillment, in the transportation, and the logistics space. I think one that I don't want to say failed because the idea of it was really good is there has been a number of different, and I won't name the companies, but there's been a number of different initiatives to aggregate and potentially disintermediate shippers' transportation movements. So collaborative transportation. And candidly, because of the complexity, I think, of the rules itself, it just really didn't work very well. And to this day, I believe you're still seeing multiple examples of potential for it to work better, but the intent of collaborative transportation is still not working that well today. And it's a great example of something that's needed because of driver shortages, of container shortages, of lack of appropriate logistics funding. That segment remains very inefficient in the US, but also globally, quite candidly.
And when you think about it, and when you were an SVP, and also when you're working with certain companies and so on, like how can somebody that's at an SVP level or at the EVP level, call it as you will, but basically heading up a supply chain, there's so many things they have to look after, right? Like there's a long-term strategy, there's a firefighting they have every day, then there's thousands of people that they're managing. How can they get involved in tech, which sometimes can sound like maybe very nitty-gritty, like very like detail oriented, and maybe I don't know, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't have time for these things.
Well, what I would tell you is I would always start with, any leader at any level should really be focused on problem solving, and in especially, of course, a leader at that level with large teams is focused on leadership and development, but operationally you're always problem solving. And one of the things that I sort of pride myself on, and I try to help mentor and bring folks along with this, and other people do it better than but I have had some success in it, is when I'm looking at technology, I go in knowing a problem I need to solve, but because my scope of leadership is broad, I'm actually trying to solve for multiple problems with that technology. And over time, I've had some success looking at a technology that is solving a fundamental problem and applying it to a different problem. And I think that is a big role in leadership right now is everyone has gone through their careers, be it short, long, intermediate, problem solving. But the ability to use those experiences and apply that problem solving to a new set of problems is a bit of a unique skill. And it's one that I think was and is critical during this time frame and will be going forward. Is because remember I talked about kind of that great irony, very innovative new dynamics in supply chain, but many of the problems themselves are fundamentally the same. So if you think about all these components of supply chain, a good skill set would be is to take that experience of problem solving and attempt to apply it to a different problem.
And adding to that, I mean, if you think again back to the beginning of your career and now, what do you think makes a great supply chain leader today, and maybe even as opposed to like what they were like before? I mean, what type of skill set do they need?
Yeah, I think we out, and you and I have talked before, right? And it's probably a bit derogatory, but you know what? Old school versus just a good leader. And, I think in the past, things were a little bit more rigid, and the concept of experience alone was good, valuable, and sort of moved you forward in your career. I think so specific experience in specific progress. I think today that's what's hurting us inside of some of these COVID things that have been amplified. So in other words, sort of in maybe a older way of thinking about it, and I wouldn't say old, but a previous way of thinking about it was skill sets like negotiation, gaining the advantage on suppliers. Those were things that were seemingly important. Treating supply chains as cyclical. So I use my experience to know that in 2 or 3 years, this problem will happen again, and I will create a supply chain that is able to adapt to that new problem. That's kind of the opposite of what I'm talking about, is using your skill set to apply to a new problem. And that's happened, today. And in the port situation in ocean freight, I think too many leaders had done it for so long because it took a specific skill set, but they've attempted to try to solve the problem in the same way. I will say now that it's starting to change. So that's a good thing. Because over time, ocean freight was always cyclical. New capacity came in, you negotiated rates down, you moved your freight. Occasionally, capacity would get tight, you pay a little more. It doesn't work like that at all anymore. The only thing I would say is sort of on the new skill sets. So those are all good to have in your sort of pocket, because again, if you can adjust your problem solving to new sets of problems, it's going to be really valuable. I would say in today's supply chain leaders, overall, especially from an experiential perspective, having many experiences in many occasions to do things like problem solve or develop or mentor or learn, but best yet to learn, is much more valuable than having this longer term experience. Because the problems, although fundamental, how to solve them are changing rapidly. Technology especially is creating atmospheres where you have to call on all these different experiences you've had throughout your career and then try to apply it to this new problem.
What an interesting discussion with John. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Finally, wanted to share with you that next year, big changes are coming to the podcast. First of all, the name will no longer be Lead and Thrive. We're changing the name. There'll also be a permanent co-host with me. Do stay tuned. Please reach out to me by all means if you have any input. I frequently speak with business leaders that have listened to me and they give me some input, but would like to have a larger interaction with my audience next year. Have a great Christmas season, and we'll be in touch in 2022. Goodbye.